There is a place on Earth so deep, so dark, and so crushing that we know more about the surface of the moon than what lives inside it. It's called the Mariana Trench, and it sits right here on our own planet, 7 miles straight down. If you dropped Mount Everest into it, the entire mountain would disappear, and there'd still be over a mile of water above it. The pressure down there, over 1,000 times what you feel right now, enough to crush unprotected submarines, enough to make titanium bend. Only around 27 people have ever made it to the bottom, and for most of history, that number was smaller than the 12 astronauts who walked on the moon. The descent alone takes hours. Sunlight vanishes within the first few hundred feet. Communication with the surface becomes unreliable, and the deeper you go, the stranger things get, because something is alive down there, not just surviving, thriving, in complete darkness, in cold that never changes, under pressure that should make life impossible. And the things scientists have recorded down there, the movements, the sounds, the creatures that look like they belong in a nightmare, some of it still doesn't have a clean explanation. We've sent equipment down, we've filmed it, we've listened, and somehow, every single time, we come back with more questions than answers. So why are scientists still so reluctant to go back? That's exactly what this video is about, and I promise you, by the end, you'll never look at the ocean the same way again. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because this is the kind of thing we do. Now, let's go down, far from any shoreline. Beyond the familiar routes of ships and weather, the ocean floor begins a slow and almost imperceptible descent near a chain of islands in the western Pacific, close to Guam. Nothing at the surface suggests what lies beneath. The water moves as it always has, winds pass overhead, and light dances across gentle waves. Yet far below, the structure of the planet itself bends in a way that has been unfolding for millions of years, shaping one of the most extreme landscapes on Earth. Here, two vast sections of the Earth's crust meet in quiet persistence. One plate, dense and ancient, presses steadily against another, and over immense spans of time, it begins to slip beneath it. This motion is slow, measured in centimeters each year, yet it carries the weight of entire continents. As the descending plate sinks into the mantle, the edge of the overlying plate is pulled downward, forming a long, curving depression in the seafloor. This is not a sudden collapse or a violent rupture, but a gradual folding, as if the surface of the Earth were yielding to a force too constant to resist. The trench extends for thousands of kilometers, tracing a subtle arc across the ocean floor. Its scale is difficult to grasp, not only in depth but in length, stretching far beyond what any single descent could reveal. Along its edge, the boundary between plates continues its slow movement, shaping the trench even now, deepening it in increments too small to notice in a human lifetime, yet profound when measured across geological time. What makes this region the deepest point on Earth is not a single factor, but a convergence of conditions. The descending plate is older and colder than many others, which makes it heavier and more inclined to sink. As it moves downward, it pulls the seafloor with it more sharply than in other subduction zones, creating a deeper and more pronounced curve. The surrounding structure of the plates allows this motion to continue without interruption, without the resistance that might otherwise limit its depth. Above this hidden boundary, the ocean conceals everything. There are no visible signs of the immense forces at work below, no indication of the immense drop that begins beneath the waves. The trench does not announce itself at the surface. It exists in silence, defined not by what can be seen, but by the absence of anything that might reveal its presence. Along its length, the trench is not uniform. Some sections descend more steeply, while others form gentler slopes that lead into darker regions below. Sediments drift down from above, settling slowly across its floor, softening the contours of the landscape while preserving its immense depth. The structure is both dynamic and still, shaped continuously by forces that operate far beyond immediate perception. This formation is part of a larger system, one that reshapes the planet over time. The same process that forms trenches also drives volcanic arcs and earthquakes in nearby regions, linking the deep ocean to distant landscapes through a shared movement beneath the surface. The trench is not an isolated feature, but a visible edge of a much larger cycle, one that renews and recycles the Earth's crust over millions of years. Yet within this system, the Mariana Trench stands apart. Its depth surpasses all others, not through sudden change, but through the quiet accumulation of geological conditions aligned over vast stretches of time. It is the result of persistence, of pressure applied slowly and without pause, carving a path downward into the planet's outer layers. In this place, the surface of the Earth bends farther than anywhere else, creating a space that feels detached from everything above it. The trench is not simply a depth, but a consequence of the planet's continuous motion, a reminder that even the most stable ground is part of an ongoing transformation, unfolding far beneath the reach of light. Long before modern instruments refined the view of the deep, a single vessel began a descent guided more by engineering resolve than certainty. In 1960, the bathyscaphe Trieste carried two men into a part of the ocean that had never been directly reached, its rounded pressure sphere suspended beneath a vast float filled with gasoline, chosen not for fuel, but for its buoyancy. The craft moved downward, not with speed, but with patience, releasing ballast in measured intervals as it slipped beneath layers of water that gradually dimmed into a muted blue, then into something far less defined. As the hours passed, the world outside narrowed into a dim and shifting field. The descent took nearly 5 hours, each minute marked by the steady increase of pressure pressing against the hull. Inside, the space was confined, just enough for two occupants to sit close together, surrounded by instruments that offered only fragments of the environment beyond. There was no horizon to orient the mind, no reference for distance, only gauges and faint exterior light that faded with each passing depth. At intervals, small disturbances appeared beyond the thick viewing port, drifting particles catching what little illumination remained. These fragments, suspended in the water, gave the impression of slow movement, though the vessel itself continued downward in near stillness. The deeper it went, the less the outside world resembled anything familiar, until even the idea of direction seemed to soften, replaced by a quiet sense of descent without visible markers. When the Trieste finally reached the bottom, it settled gently into the seafloor, disturbing a fine layer of sediment that rose in a soft cloud around it. For a brief time, visibility dropped further, the particles drifting upward before slowly dispersing again. Then, as the water cleared, something appeared within the limited range of the craft's observation window. A shape, small and pale, moved across the seafloor with a motion that did not match the expectations of such an environment. It resembled a fish, flat-bodied and delicate in form, gliding just above the sediment, as though the immense pressure surrounding it were of little consequence. The sight was brief, but distinct enough to be noted, and it stood in quiet contrast to the assumptions held at the time about life at such depths. The prevailing understanding had suggested that complex vertebrates would not endure under those conditions, that only simpler forms might exist where pressure reached such extremes. Within the confined interior of the vessel, the observation was recorded, yet even in that moment, uncertainty lingered. The limitations of visibility, the distortion of light through thick glass, and the unfamiliar nature of the environment left room for interpretation. Whether the shape was truly a fish or a form altered by perception in the deep became a point of reflection that extended far beyond the duration of the dive itself. The ascent began soon after, the craft releasing ballast and slowly rising through the same layers it had passed before. The return took time, each stage marked by subtle changes in light and pressure until the surface eventually came back into view. What had been seen below did not resolve into certainty upon return, but instead remained suspended between observation and question. In the years that followed, that single moment at the bottom would continue to echo through scientific discussion. The possibility of a fish existing at such depth challenged existing models of pressure tolerance and biological structure, prompting further exploration and study. Yet the brief nature of the sighting, combined with the conditions under which it was observed, ensured that it would never fully settle into simple confirmation. The Trieste's descent marked a threshold, not only in reaching the deepest part of the ocean, but in revealing how much remained uncertain even after arrival. The seafloor had been touched, yet what lived there and how it endured remained only partially seen, leaving a quiet space for inquiry that would persist for decades. Light from the first deep-sea cameras did not arrive as a clear window, but as a narrow, artificial glow pressing into a vast and unlit space. When these early systems were lowered into the trench, what returned was not a continuous image, but fragments of motion and shadow, suspended in a darkness that resisted interpretation. The footage carried a texture unlike anything seen in shallower waters, where familiar patterns of swimming and movement usually guided recognition. Within that limited field, shapes appeared and faded with a slowness that felt detached from ordinary behavior. Some forms seemed to drift rather than swim, their edges soft and indistinct, as if the surrounding water itself carried them without effort. Others moved with such gradual changes in position that it became difficult to determine whether the motion belonged to the organism or to the subtle currents of the environment. Time, as captured by the camera, seemed stretched, each second holding more stillness than action. The equipment itself contributed to this sense of uncertainty. Early cameras relied on fixed lighting and narrow lenses, illuminating only a small portion of the surroundings, while leaving everything beyond in complete obscurity. When a creature entered that beam, it did so without context, emerging from darkness without any clear origin and disappearing again just as abruptly. There were no reference points, no sense of distance or scale, only isolated encounters framed by the limits of the machine. As the recordings were studied, the challenge of identification became apparent. Many of the shapes did not match known species, at least not in any form that could be easily confirmed. Features appeared distorted, not necessarily because the organisms themselves were unfamiliar, but because the conditions altered how they were perceived. Light refracted through water at extreme depth, interacting with suspended particles and pressure-adapted tissues, created subtle shifts in appearance that complicated even careful observation. Some creatures appeared almost transparent, their internal structures faintly visible under artificial light, while others reflected illumination in unexpected ways, giving the impression of forms that changed as they moved. The absence of clear outlines made classification difficult, and in many cases, scientists could only describe what they saw without assigning it to any known group. The footage did not offer enough detail to resolve these uncertainties, leaving each observation partially open. Movement itself became a point of focus. In more familiar parts of the ocean, motion tends to follow recognizable patterns driven by muscle and intention. Here, however, the distinction between active movement and passive drifting blurred. A slight shift in orientation, a gentle rise or descent, could suggest life, yet just as easily be attributed to unseen currents. The environment introduced ambiguity into every frame, making even basic interpretations tentative. This ambiguity extended beyond biology into perception. The human eye and mind are shaped by environments filled with light and structure, where edges and contrasts define objects clearly. In the deep trench, those cues are absent or altered, and the footage reflected that difference. What seemed unusual or unfamiliar was not always entirely new, but filtered through conditions that removed the usual anchors of recognition. Over time, these early recordings became part of a broader effort to understand the deep, yet they carried with them a persistent hesitation. Each image suggested the presence of life adapted to extreme conditions, but also reminded observers of the limits of their tools and interpretations. The camera had reached into a place where visibility was not only reduced but fundamentally transformed, and what it brought back existed somewhere between observation and uncertainty. In that space, the trench revealed itself not as a place of clear discovery, but as one where even direct evidence required careful reading, where every movement, every shape, carried layers of possibility shaped by the depth in which it appeared. Far below the reach of sunlight, where the surface world no longer shapes the rhythm of life, existence settles into a different kind of order. There is no day or night here, no shifting patterns of light to guide growth or movement. Instead, life persists within a system that unfolds slowly, almost imperceptibly, shaped not by abundance but by scarcity, where every form of energy is received, conserved, and used with careful restraint. In this depth, the familiar foundation of ecosystems is absent. There are no plants drawing energy from light, no wide networks of grazing and predation built upon that base. What remains is a quieter process, one that begins far above, where fragments of organic matter detach from the surface world and begin a long descent. These particles, often referred to as marine snow, drift downward over days or weeks, carrying with them traces of life from shallower waters. As they fall, much of this material is consumed or broken apart before reaching the deepest layers. Only a small fraction completes the journey, arriving as a fine, scattered supply that settles across the sea floor. For the organisms that live here, this sparse arrival becomes the primary source of sustenance, a steady but limited input that shapes every aspect of survival. Life in this environment adapts not through speed or competition, but through efficiency. Metabolic processes operate at reduced rates, allowing organisms to endure long periods with minimal intake. Growth is slow, sometimes extending across years or even decades, and reproduction follows a similar pace, aligned with the availability of resources rather than any fixed cycle. Movement, when it occurs, is measured and deliberate, conserving energy rather than expending it. This restraint extends to the structure of the ecosystem itself. Without the constant input of energy seen in sunlit waters, complexity gives way to simplicity. Food chains are shorter, often consisting of only a few links, each dependent on the limited material that arrives from above. Detritivores process the settling debris, while others feed upon these organisms in turn, forming a network that remains stable, not through abundance, but through balance. The absence of light also alters how organisms interact with their surroundings. Vision becomes less central, replaced by other senses attuned to subtle changes in the environment. Chemical signals, minute shifts in pressure, and faint vibrations in the water provide information where light cannot. These adaptations allow life to continue without the cues that dominate in other parts of the ocean, creating a system that functions independently of the surface world's influence. Despite the extreme conditions, this ecosystem is not inactive. It operates continuously, though at a pace that can appear almost still when compared to more dynamic environments. Each organism plays a role within this limited network, contributing to a cycle that recycles and redistributes the scarce energy available. There is no excess, no rapid turnover, only a steady continuation shaped by constraint. What emerges from this is a form of life that exists on the edge of what is typically expected, sustained not by abundance, but by persistence. The deep trench does not support life in the way more familiar environments do, yet it does not exclude it either. Instead, it offers a narrow path, one defined by careful use of resources and an ability to endure conditions that allow little margin for waste. In this setting, the idea of an ecosystem becomes something quieter, more contained. It is a system that does not expand or flourish in visible ways, but maintains itself through continuity, drawing from a distant source and adapting to the limits imposed by depth. Life here does not announce itself, yet it remains, shaped by an environment that asks for little and gives even less. At these depths, form begins to follow a different set of rules, shaped not by strength in the familiar sense, but by the ability to yield. Many of the organisms that inhabit this environment appear almost insubstantial at first glance, their bodies lacking the firm structures often associated with survival. Instead of rigid outlines and defined edges, there are forms that seem to dissolve into their surroundings, composed of tissues that bend, compress, and recover without resistance. Transparency becomes a common trait, not as an aesthetic feature, but as a practical one. With no light to reflect or absorb in meaningful ways, pigmentation offers little advantage. As a result, many organisms carry bodies that allow light, when present, to pass through them, revealing internal structures in faint and shifting detail. These forms do not conceal themselves through color, but through absence, blending into the environment by offering nothing for the eye to anchor to. Among these inhabitants are amphipods, small crustaceans that move across the seafloor with quiet persistence. Their bodies, though delicate in appearance, are structured to withstand the immense pressure that surrounds them. Nearby, sea cucumbers rest along the sediment, their soft forms extending and contracting slowly as they process the material beneath them. These organisms, often overlooked in other parts of the ocean, become central here, adapted to a life that depends on patience rather than speed. Further along the depths, snailfish appear, their bodies almost gelatinous, lacking the dense muscle and bone that characterize many shallow water species. Their structure allows them to exist where more rigid forms would fail, their tissues matching the pressure of the surrounding water rather than resisting it. This balance reduces the stress placed on their bodies, allowing them to move and function within an environment that would compress less adaptable forms. The absence of hard shells and heavy skeletal elements is not a limitation, but a reflection of the conditions in which these organisms live. At such depths, materials that provide strength in other environments can become liabilities, creating points of weakness under constant pressure. Calcium carbonate, commonly used in shells, becomes less stable, and maintaining rigid structures requires energy that is scarce. In contrast, softer bodies distribute pressure evenly, avoiding the concentration of force that can lead to structural failure. This shift towards softness extends beyond individual organisms to the overall character of life in the trench. Movement is often subtle, with bodies that glide, settle, or gently adjust their position rather than exerting force against the water. The environment favors those that can exist in harmony with the surrounding pressure rather than those that attempt to resist it. Even feeding reflects this adaptation. Many of these organisms process fine sediments or capture small particles, relying on methods that require minimal energy. Their anatomy supports this approach with flexible structures that can extend or retract as needed, conserving resources while maintaining function. There is a continuity between form and behavior, each reinforcing the other in a system shaped by constraint. What emerges is a collection of life forms that challenge expectations not through complexity, but through simplicity. Their fragility is only apparent, a result of viewing them through the lens of environments where strength is measured differently. In the deep trench, resilience takes on another meaning, one defined by the ability to exist without excess, to endure without rigidity, and to adapt by becoming part of the very conditions that define the space around them. These organisms do not stand apart from their environment, but exist within it as extensions of its properties, shaped by pressure, scarcity, and time. Their forms, though delicate in appearance, carry a quiet stability, one that allows life to continue in a place where conventional structures would not endure. Sound, in most parts of the ocean, carries with it a sense of presence, a continuous exchange of motion and interaction that defines the space. Waves break, currents shift, and countless organisms contribute to a layered acoustic environment that rarely settles into complete stillness. Yet as depth increases, that familiar tapestry begins to thin, not by disappearing entirely, but by changing in character until it becomes something far less recognizable. In the deepest regions, the sources of sound diminish. Surface activity no longer reaches these layers with clarity, its energy dispersed and weakened long before arriving. The movements of larger marine life, so often a part of the ocean's acoustic landscape, become rare, leaving behind an environment where sound is not absent, but sparse and distant. What remains is a quiet that is not defined by silence alone, but by the absence of expected patterns. Water, even under extreme pressure, continues to carry sound efficiently, yet the way it moves through this environment shifts subtly. The density of the surrounding medium increases, altering how vibrations propagate. Sound can travel farther in some cases, bending along layers where temperature and pressure create gradual changes in speed. These pathways allow certain frequencies to persist over long distances, while others fade more quickly, leaving behind a selective acoustic field that favors deeper, lower tones. Within this space, occasional sounds emerge, not as constant features, but as isolated events. Low-frequency pulses drift through the water, their origins often uncertain. Some may come from distant geological activity, subtle movements within the Earth's crust that release energy into the surrounding water. Others may be produced by organisms adapted to communicate or navigate within these depths, though their signals are often too faint or infrequent to form a consistent pattern. The intervals between these sounds can be long, measured not in seconds, but in stretches that allow the environment to return to near stillness. In those intervals, the absence of noise becomes more pronounced, shaping the perception of the space itself. Without continuous auditory input, there is little to define distance or movement, leaving only the subtle awareness of the surrounding water pressing in from all directions. This stillness is not a lack of activity, but a reflection of how processes unfold at depth. Movements are slower, interactions more limited, and the generation of sound follows this reduced pace. The environment does not produce the constant signals found in more active regions, and as a result, the acoustic landscape becomes minimal, composed of brief occurrences separated by extended quiet. For instruments designed to capture sound, this presents both clarity and ambiguity. The absence of overlapping noise allows individual signals to be detected with precision, yet the rarity of those signals makes interpretation difficult. A single recorded sound may stand alone, without context or repetition, leaving its source open to consideration rather than confirmation. Over time, this pattern of quiet, punctuated by occasional sound, becomes a defining feature of the deep. It is not the complete absence of vibration, but a selective presence, where only certain frequencies and events persist. The environment shapes not only what is heard, but how it is perceived, creating a space where sound carries weight precisely because it is rare. In this setting, the ocean reveals another aspect of its depth, one that is not immediately visible, but sensed through the absence of what is usually expected. The quiet here is not empty, but structured, shaped by the same forces that define the physical environment. It is a condition that does not demand attention, yet remains constant, a subtle reminder that even in near stillness, the ocean continues to move and resonate in ways that are not always apparent. The first sign of change is not dramatic, but gradual, almost easy to overlook. As the descent begins, the surface remains visible for a time, its brightness filtering down in soft, wavering bands. Within the first few hundred meters, that light begins to thin, shifting from clear illumination into a muted blue that grows steadily dimmer. Colors lose their intensity, then their distinction, until only faint tones remain, dissolving into a uniform shade that no longer resembles daylight. As the journey continues, this fading becomes more pronounced. The water absorbs what remains of the sun's reach, leaving behind a dim, residual glow that offers just enough visibility to suggest distance without defining it. Shapes blur at the edges, and the sense of depth becomes less tied to sight and more to the awareness of continued movement. The descent carries on, steady and unhurried, as the last traces of natural light withdraw entirely. Beyond this point, there is no transition back. The environment enters a state of complete darkness, not as an absence that fluctuates, but as a constant condition. Artificial light, when present, defines the immediate surroundings, but beyond its reach, there is nothing to reflect, nothing to reveal. The space becomes defined by what is illuminated moment to moment, while everything else remains outside perception. At the same time, temperature begins its quiet decline. The warmth retained near the surface fades as the descent progresses, replaced by colder layers that settle closer to the freezing point. This shift is not abrupt, but continuous, each meter bringing a subtle change that accumulates over time. By the time the deeper regions are reached, the water holds a steady chill, one that remains consistent regardless of distance traveled. Pressure, though not visible, accompanies this descent at every stage, increasing steadily with depth. It does not announce itself in sudden changes, but builds gradually, shaping the environment in ways that become more pronounced as the journey continues. The surrounding water grows denser, more compressive, influencing both movement and structure, even if those effects are not immediately apparent. The passage downward unfolds over hours, marked not by distinct events, but by a continuous progression through layers that differ in subtle but meaningful ways. Each stage brings a reduction in familiar reference points until the surface world feels distant not only in space, but in character. The environment becomes more uniform, more contained, defined by consistency rather than variation. In this prolonged descent, time itself seems to take on a different quality. Without changing light or shifting surroundings to mark its passage, each moment blends into the next, creating a sense of continuity that mirrors the steady movement downward. The journey is measured not by visible milestones, but by the gradual accumulation of change, each layer contributing to a deeper transformation. Eventually, the descent reaches depths where the conditions stabilize. Darkness remains complete, temperature holds near its lowest point, and the pressure continues its constant presence. The movement downward slows, approaching its endpoint with the same measured pace that defined its beginning. What began in a world shaped by light and motion has transitioned into one defined by stillness and uniformity. In this environment, the absence of variation becomes its own defining feature. There are no sudden shifts, no abrupt transitions, only the continuation of conditions that remain consistent across vast distances. The journey downward does not end with a dramatic arrival, but with a quiet settling into a space where change has already taken place, and what remains is the enduring presence of depth itself. Nothing in the deep announces itself with sudden force, yet everything there is held within an unbroken weight that does not ease, not even for a moment. It is not a push from one direction or another, but a steady compression arriving from all sides at once, surrounding every surface, every structure, every boundary between inside and out. This pressure does not pulse or fluctuate in ways that can be easily sensed. Instead, it remains constant, an invisible presence that defines the environment more completely than anything that can be seen. As depth increases, this force accumulates without interruption. Each meter adds another layer, another increment, until the surrounding water becomes not just a medium, but a continuous load pressing inward. Materials that perform reliably in other conditions begin to behave differently here, not because they are poorly made, but because the environment demands a level of integrity that leaves no room for even the smallest imperfection. A minute flaw, something that would be inconsequential at the surface, can become a point of failure under these conditions. A microscopic crack, an uneven weld, a seal that is not perfectly aligned, each carries the potential to give way when exposed to such sustained compression. The force does not need to find a large opening. It requires only a weakness, a place where resistance is slightly lower than the surrounding structure. Once found, that weakness can expand rapidly, the pressure exploiting it with a consistency that does not hesitate. For this reason, the design of deep-sea vehicles follows a different philosophy. Strength alone is not enough. It must be paired with uniformity. Spherical shapes are often chosen for pressure vessels, not for aesthetics, but because they distribute force evenly across their surface, avoiding points where stress might concentrate. Materials are selected for their ability to endure compression without deforming in unpredictable ways, and every joint, every seal, is constructed with precision that approaches the limits of manufacturing. Even with these precautions, the challenge remains ongoing. The environment does not allow for partial success. It requires complete reliability. Systems must function under conditions that cannot be easily replicated for extended periods on the surface, making testing both essential and inherently limited. Engineers rely on calculations, simulations, and controlled experiments. Yet the true test occurs only during descent, when the vehicle enters the very conditions it was designed to withstand. Inside these vessels, the awareness of this constant pressure becomes part of the experience. The structure holds firm, maintaining a boundary that separates the interior from the immense force outside, yet that boundary is understood to be the result of careful design and precise construction. There is no margin for neglect, no allowance for oversight, only the quiet assurance that every component is performing as intended. The risk carried on each descent is not always visible, nor does it manifest in dramatic ways. It exists in the background, a steady consideration that accompanies the journey downward. The deeper the vehicle travels, the more this risk becomes embedded in the environment itself, not as a sudden threat, but as a continuous condition that must be respected. Over time, advancements in technology have improved the ability to reach these depths, yet the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. Pressure continues to define the limits of exploration, setting boundaries that can be approached but never ignored. Each successful descent reflects a balance between human ingenuity and the unyielding conditions of the deep, a balance maintained through precision, preparation, and an understanding of the forces that never cease. In this way, the ocean at its greatest depths reveals a form of persistence, one that does not rely on movement or change, but on constancy. The pressure is always present, always equal in its distribution, shaping both the environment and the methods used to explore it, a silent force that endures without variation. Inside the small interior of a deep diving vessel, space is reduced to what is necessary, and nothing more. Surfaces are close. Instruments occupy much of the available area, and movement is limited to small adjustments rather than full motion. The design is deliberate, shaped by the need to withstand the surrounding environment. Yet it creates a setting where time is experienced in stillness, marked more by observation than by action. As the descent progresses, the separation from the surface becomes less an abstract idea and more a steady awareness. There is no view of open distance, no shifting horizon to orient the mind. The outside exists only within the narrow reach of external lights, revealing a confined portion of the surrounding water, while everything beyond remains undefined. Without natural reference points, direction loses its usual meaning, replaced by the simple understanding that the vessel continues downward. Hours pass in this contained space, each one blending into the next without clear markers. The absence of daylight removes the familiar rhythm that usually divides time, leaving only the steady presence of instruments and the gradual changes they record. The environment does not offer variation in light or sound to signal progression, and as a result, the passage of time becomes more internal, measured by attention and awareness rather than external cues. Within this setting, the awareness of depth settles quietly into thought. The knowledge of being miles below the surface does not present itself as a sudden realization, but as a continuous presence, something understood and carried without interruption. It exists alongside the steady conditions of the descent, neither increasing nor diminishing, but remaining constant as the vessel moves through the water. The physical environment inside remains controlled, maintaining pressure and temperature at levels suitable for human presence. Yet beyond that boundary, the conditions differ entirely, and that contrast is always present in the background. The vessel becomes a thin separation between two vastly different states, its structure holding against the surrounding force while those inside rely on its integrity without direct interaction with what lies outside. Silence within the vessel is shaped by machinery and the faint sounds of operation. Yet these are limited and consistent. There are no external noises that carry through with clarity, no indications of movement beyond what is visible through the viewing port. This creates a setting where attention turns inward, focusing on the immediate environment and the information provided by instruments rather than external stimuli. The psychological experience unfolds gradually, without sharp transitions. Confinement becomes part of the environment, not as a sudden constraint, but as a condition that defines the space from the beginning. The lack of expansive views or changing surroundings encourages a different kind of awareness, one that remains steady and focused, adapting to the limitations without resistance. In this context, the descent is not only a movement through physical space, but a shift in how that space is perceived. The vastness of the ocean is understood intellectually, yet the experience itself is defined by a small, enclosed interior, where the scale of the outside world is reduced to what can be observed within a limited frame. This contrast remains present throughout, shaping the experience without altering its calm progression. As time continues, the environment maintains its consistency. There are no sudden changes to interrupt the flow, no events that redefine the experience, only the ongoing presence of depth, confinement, and controlled conditions. The vessel moves within this setting with steady purpose, and those inside remain part of that movement, observing, recording, and existing within a space that is both isolated and connected to the vast environment beyond its walls. After the first descents touched the deepest floor, the momentum that carried those early efforts did not continue in a steady line. Instead, it softened and receded, leaving behind a pause that stretched far longer than the initial excitement might have suggested. The knowledge gained remained, but the act of returning became less frequent, not from a loss of interest, but from the quiet accumulation of challenges that made each attempt increasingly difficult to justify. Technology, at the time, had reached a threshold that allowed for brief access, yet it was not prepared to sustain repeated journeys into such conditions. The systems required to descend, observe, and return safely were complex and fragile in their own ways, dependent on materials and designs that operated close to their limits. Each mission required careful preparation, and even then, the margin for uncertainty remained present, shaping decisions long before any descent began. In the years that followed, attention shifted toward areas of the ocean that were more accessible, where research could be conducted with greater frequency and lower risk. These regions offered opportunities to gather data, to refine methods, and to expand understanding without the same level of constraint. The deepest trench, by contrast, remained at the edge of what was possible, its conditions demanding resources and precision that were not always available. Cost became another quiet influence, guiding the direction of exploration. Constructing and maintaining vessels capable of withstanding such depth required significant investment, not only in materials, but in expertise, testing, and support systems. Each descent represented not just a scientific endeavor, but a logistical commitment that extended beyond the immediate journey, encompassing years of preparation and coordination. Risk, though rarely visible, remained central to these considerations. The environment did not allow for easy recovery from failure, and the consequences of even minor issues could be severe. This understanding did not discourage exploration entirely, but it encouraged a measured approach, one that balanced curiosity with caution, ensuring that each decision accounted for the conditions that could not be altered. As time passed, the trench began to occupy a different place within scientific thought. It was not forgotten, but it became distant, more often discussed than directly explored. Data from earlier missions continued to be studied, revisited with new perspectives, and developing theories, allowing the trench to remain present within research without requiring immediate return. This distance created a sense of abstraction. The deepest point on Earth existed as a concept supported by limited direct observation, its characteristics inferred as much as they were witnessed. The few moments captured during early descents carried weight, not only for what they revealed, but for what they left unresolved. These fragments became reference points, guiding discussion while also highlighting the gaps that remained. In laboratories and institutions, the trench was approached through models, simulations, and indirect study, its environment reconstructed through calculations and comparison with less extreme conditions. This allowed progress to continue in a different form, advancing understanding without the need for constant physical presence at depth. Yet the absence of regular exploration did not diminish the significance of the place itself. If anything, the distance allowed it to remain unchanged in perception, a stable reference point within a field that continued to evolve elsewhere. The trench held its position at the boundary of knowledge, not actively pursued at all times, but never fully set aside. In this extended interval, exploration did not end, but paused, shaped by the realities of technology, cost, and risk. The ocean continued its processes without interruption, while human efforts adjusted, waiting for a moment when the balance between capability and challenge would shift once more. Decades passed before a single descent returned with a different kind of intention, not as a continuation of earlier efforts, but as a reimagining shaped by advances that had slowly taken form over time. When James Cameron prepared for his solo dive, the approach reflected both accumulated knowledge and a willingness to refine what had once been experimental. The vessel designed for this journey was not a direct extension of earlier craft, but something more focused, built to operate with precision in conditions that had long resisted frequent access. The submersible, known as Deep Sea Challenger, carried within it a series of changes that spoke to years of development. Its structure was arranged vertically rather than horizontally, a form chosen to better manage descent and maneuverability. Materials were selected for their ability to endure sustained compression while maintaining reliability across the entire duration of the mission. Each component served a defined role, contributing to a system that aimed not only to reach the bottom, but to remain there with greater stability. As the descent began, the process unfolded with a familiarity shaped by past experience, yet the tools now available offered a different level of interaction with the environment. Cameras were no longer limited to narrow and indistinct views. High-definition imaging allowed for clearer observation, capturing detail that had once been lost in shadow or distortion. Lighting systems extended the visible range, illuminating the surroundings with a steadiness that revealed texture and movement with greater clarity. These improvements did not alter the conditions of the trench itself, but they changed how those conditions could be observed. Where earlier missions had returned with brief and uncertain glimpses, this descent aimed to gather sustained visual records, allowing for extended study beyond the moment of observation. The environment remained constant, yet the means of perceiving it had shifted, offering a more continuous connection between presence and understanding. During the time spent at depth, the submersible maintained its position with careful control, allowing its systems to operate without interruption. Instruments recorded data related to pressure, temperature, and chemical composition, building a more complete picture of the environment than had previously been possible. The observations were not limited to what could be seen, but extended into measurements that could be analyzed later, contributing to a broader framework of knowledge. The purpose of this return was not defined by a single question, but by a collection of objectives that reflected both curiosity and caution. Scientists sought to better understand the organisms that lived at these depths, the structure of the seafloor, and the processes that shaped this environment over time. There was also an interest in refining the methods of exploration itself, testing how new designs performed under conditions that had once limited repeated access. The descent, though guided by advanced technology, retained the same measured pace that had characterized earlier journeys. It unfolded gradually, moving through layers that had long separated the surface from the deepest point. The difference lay not in the speed of travel, but in the ability to observe, to record, and to remain present with greater continuity than before. As the mission concluded and the ascent began, the data collected did not resolve all uncertainties, nor did it transform the trench into a fully understood environment. Instead, it added depth to what was already known, filling certain gaps while revealing others that had not been previously considered. The return did not mark an end, but a continuation, shaped by improved tools and a renewed commitment to understanding a place that had remained largely beyond reach. In this renewed presence, the trench was approached once more with care, its conditions unchanged, yet its observation refined. The journey reflected both progress and restraint, a balance between advancing capability and respecting the environment that continued to define the limits of exploration. What emerged from that return was not a single revelation, but a series of observations that settled into place with quiet persistence. The images and samples gathered did not reshape the deep into something fully understood. Instead, they revealed details that had remained hidden, small pieces of a much larger structure that continued to resist complete interpretation. Each finding added to a growing picture, one that expanded without resolving the space it described. Among the most notable results were the organisms themselves, forms of life that had not been recorded in earlier descents with the same clarity. These were not dramatic or imposing creatures, but subtle presences shaped by conditions that favored restraint over excess. Some species appeared newly identified, their structures and behaviors distinct enough to suggest they had adapted along paths not previously documented. Their existence confirmed that life persisted even in these depths, not as an exception, but as part of a system that remained active despite its limitations. The evidence of life extended beyond individual organisms. The seafloor, though appearing still at first glance, supported a network of interactions that became more apparent under sustained observation. Small movements, traces of feeding, and patterns within the sediment indicated ongoing processes, a continuity that connected these depths to the broader cycles of the ocean. What had once seemed isolated now revealed subtle links, suggesting that even the deepest regions were not entirely separate from the rest of the marine environment. Certain biological traits stood out, not for their complexity, but for how they diverged from expectations. Some organisms displayed forms that appeared simplified, yet functioned with efficiency that matched the constraints of their surroundings. Others showed structural adaptations that balanced delicacy with resilience, maintaining integrity under conditions that would disrupt more rigid forms. These traits did not align neatly with models developed from shallower ecosystems, requiring a reconsideration of how life could organize itself under such pressure and scarcity. There were also chemical signatures within collected samples that hinted at processes occurring at a microscopic level. Compounds associated with metabolic activity were present, indicating that life was not only existing, but actively maintaining itself through pathways suited to the available resources. These findings suggested that the deep trench supported not just isolated organisms, but systems capable of sustaining themselves over time, even with limited input. Yet, for each observation, there remained a measure of uncertainty. The data, while more detailed than before, did not provide complete explanations. The behaviors of certain organisms could be described, but not fully understood. The relationships between species were suggested, but not clearly defined. Even the extent of biodiversity at these depths remained open, shaped by what had been observed, but not limited by it. In many ways, the return to the trench clarified the presence of life without simplifying its nature. It confirmed that the environment supported living systems, yet it also revealed how little was known about the mechanisms that sustained them. The improved clarity of images and measurements did not eliminate ambiguity. Instead, it brought it into sharper focus, making the gaps in understanding more visible. As these findings were studied, they contributed to a broader realization that the deepest parts of the ocean could not be fully interpreted through frameworks developed elsewhere. The trench operated according to conditions that required their own perspective, one that accounted for extremes not commonly encountered. Each discovery added to this perspective, building a foundation that remained incomplete, yet steadily expanding. In this way, the results of the descent did not close the questions that had followed earlier missions. They extended them, giving them new form and direction, ensuring that the trench remained not only a place of discovery, but a space where understanding continued to evolve without reaching a final conclusion. Long before any instrument confirmed it, the journey of human materials had already begun, carried invisibly through the same pathways that connect distant parts of the ocean. What was once assumed to remain near the surface had been moving quietly downward, following currents, settling through layers, and dispersing across depths that had never been expected to receive such traces. By the time exploration returned with more precise tools, these movements had already left their mark. Within collected samples from the trench, fragments of microplastic appeared, embedded not only in the surrounding sediment, but within the bodies of organisms living at these depths. These particles, reduced to sizes barely visible, had traveled immense distances from their origin, breaking down along the way into forms that could be carried more easily through the water column. Their presence was not concentrated or overwhelming, yet it was consistent enough to be recognized, indicating that even the deepest environments were not isolated from surface activity. Alongside these fragments, chemical traces were detected, compounds associated with industrial processes and materials that had entered the ocean through various pathways. Some arrived through runoff from land, carried by rivers into coastal waters before dispersing outward. Others entered directly from maritime activity, spreading gradually through currents that circulate across vast regions. Over time, these substances followed similar routes downward, attaching to particles or dissolving into the water itself, eventually reaching depths far removed from their source. The process by which these materials descend is not rapid. It unfolds over extended periods, shaped by the slow movement of the ocean's internal systems. Particles settle through the water, sometimes aggregated with organic matter, forming small clusters that sink more efficiently than individual fragments. Currents shift and redistribute them, guiding their path in ways that are not immediately visible, yet remain consistent over time. What begins as dispersed material at the surface gradually becomes part of a downward flow that reaches even the most remote regions. At the seafloor, these materials integrate into the existing environment. Microplastics become part of the sediment, mixing with natural particles that have followed similar paths. Chemical compounds interact with the surrounding water and organisms, entering systems that operate with limited capacity to process foreign substances. The environment does not reject these additions outright, but absorbs them into its existing structure, altering it in subtle ways. For the organisms that inhabit these depths, the presence of such materials introduces conditions that did not previously exist. Microplastics can be ingested, not as a targeted action, but as a consequence of feeding within an environment where these particles are now present. Chemical traces may interact with biological processes, influencing functions in ways that are still being studied. These effects are not always immediately visible, yet they form part of the ongoing interaction between life and its surroundings. The discovery of these materials at such depth reshapes the understanding of isolation within the ocean. The trench, once considered distant from direct human influence, is now connected through pathways that extend across the entire marine system. Distance alone does not prevent the movement of substances, and depth does not fully separate environments from one another. This realization does not transform the trench into a place dominated by these materials, but it reveals a continuity that had not been fully recognized. The deepest regions remain defined by their own conditions, yet they are also part of a broader system that carries both natural and human-derived elements throughout its layers. In this way, the presence of microplastics and chemical traces becomes part of the larger narrative of the ocean, one that reflects both its capacity to connect distant environments and its role in distributing materials across vast scales. The trench remains remote, yet it is no longer entirely removed, shaped not only by geological and biological processes, but by pathways that extend upward into the wider world. At the deepest point, the ground does not rise to meet expectation, nor does it reveal sharp ridges or towering formations. Instead, it extends outward in a broad, subdued plain, its surface shaped by accumulation rather than upheaval. The terrain appears level in a way that feels almost deliberate, as though the processes that formed it favored stillness over contrast, allowing it to settle into a quiet and continuous expanse. The seafloor here is composed of fine sediment, particles that have traveled immense distances before coming to rest. Each fragment began its descent far above, carried slowly downward through layers of water until it reached a depth where movement diminished and settling became inevitable. Over time, these particles gathered, forming a soft and uniform covering that blankets the underlying structure of the trench. This accumulation does not occur in sudden deposits, but through a gradual and unbroken process. The rate of settling is slow, measured in increments that are difficult to perceive in isolation. Yet across years, centuries, and longer spans, these increments build upon one another, creating a surface that reflects the passage of time rather than the force of any single event. The result is a landscape defined by continuity, where change occurs so steadily that it appears unchanged. In this environment, the absence of dramatic features becomes its own defining characteristic. There are no jagged peaks or deep fissures within immediate view, no formations that disrupt the uniformity of the terrain. The seafloor presents itself as a consistent plane, its subtle variations revealed only through careful observation rather than immediate contrast. This simplicity stands in contrast to expectations shaped by more dynamic regions, where geological activity creates visible complexity. The sediment itself carries a record of its origin. Within it are traces of organic material, mineral fragments, and microscopic remains, each contributing to the composition of the seafloor. These elements do not remain separate, but integrate over time, forming a cohesive layer that reflects the combined influence of distant sources. The surface becomes not just a physical boundary, but a quiet archive of processes that extend far beyond the trench. Movement across this terrain is minimal. The water above, though present, does not disturb the sediment in ways that create visible change. Currents are subdued, their influence softened by depth, allowing the particles to remain largely undisturbed once they settle. When disturbances do occur, They are often localized and temporary, leaving the broader surface unchanged as the sediment resettles into place. This stillness extends beyond the physical surface into the overall character of the environment. The seafloor does not shift or evolve in ways that are immediately noticeable. Instead, it maintains a steady presence, shaped by processes that operate on scales far removed from immediate perception. The quiet persistence of these processes defines the space, giving it a sense of continuity that does not rely on visible transformation. The uniformity of the terrain also influences how it is observed. Without prominent features to guide the eye, attention turns to finer details, the texture of the sediment, the subtle variations in its composition, and the occasional presence of life that interacts with this surface. These details provide context, offering insight into a landscape that might otherwise appear unchanged. In this way, the ocean floor at its greatest depth reveals a form of simplicity that is not empty, but composed. It is shaped by accumulation, by the steady arrival of material that settles and remains. The absence of dramatic structure does not diminish its significance, but instead highlights the processes that operate quietly over time, creating a landscape defined not by sudden change, but by enduring stillness. Motion at these depths does not present itself in clear, defined gestures. Instead, it emerges gradually, often at the edge of perception, where movement and stillness seem to overlap. Within the narrow reach of observation, forms shift position so slowly that their change is noticed only over time, as if the environment itself were carrying them rather than any visible effort of their own. Many of the creatures encountered here do not propel themselves in the ways commonly associated with life in more active waters. There are no sudden bursts or rapid changes in direction. Instead, bodies drift, adjusting their orientation with subtle shifts that blend into the surrounding flow. Fins, appendages, or soft extensions move with restraint, creating just enough motion to guide position without disrupting the balance between organism and environment. This style of movement reflects the conditions that shape it. Energy is limited, and every action carries a cost that cannot be easily replaced. As a result, motion becomes measured, deliberate, and often minimal. A slight contraction or a gentle extension is enough to alter trajectory, allowing the organism to navigate its surroundings without expending more effort than necessary. The difference between movement and rest becomes less distinct, each blending into the other in a continuous, controlled rhythm. At the same time, the water itself contributes to this ambiguity. Even in these depths, where currents are subdued, there remains a subtle flow that can carry small bodies across short distances. This movement is not always visible, yet it influences how organisms appear to behave. A drifting form may be partially guided by its own adjustments, partially by the surrounding water, creating an interaction that is difficult to separate into distinct causes. For those observing from within a vessel or through recorded footage, this creates a challenge that extends beyond simple identification. It becomes difficult to determine whether a change in position is the result of intentional movement or passive transport. A creature may appear to glide without effort, yet closer attention suggests small, nearly imperceptible actions guiding that motion. The boundary between active and passive becomes blurred, shaped by conditions that do not favor clear distinction. This uncertainty is further influenced by the limitations of observation itself. The field of view is confined, and what lies beyond it remains unseen. Without a broader context, each movement is interpreted within a narrow frame, where the absence of reference points makes scale and speed harder to assess. A slow shift may represent a significant change over time, yet within the moment, it appears almost unchanged. Some organisms exhibit patterns that repeat with enough consistency to suggest intention, slight adjustments that occur at regular intervals, guiding them along subtle paths across the seafloor or through the water above it. Others remain almost entirely still, their presence defined more by position than by movement, until a gradual change reveals that they have shifted without drawing attention to the process itself. In this environment, behavior does not present itself in obvious forms. It requires careful observation and attention to detail that recognizes movement not through speed, but through persistence. Each action is understated, each adjustment small, yet together they form a pattern of life that continues without interruption. The result is a landscape of motion that resists quick interpretation. What is seen does not always align with expectation, and understanding develops slowly, shaped by repeated observation rather than immediate clarity. In the deep trench, movement becomes something to be noticed over time, a quiet expression of life that unfolds within an environment where even the smallest change carries meaning. Sustenance in the deepest regions arrives not in abundance, but in fragments, each one carrying a trace of life from far above. There is no direct source of energy here that originates within the trench itself. Instead, nourishment descends slowly through the water column, forming a continuous but sparse link between the surface and the depths below. This connection is subtle, yet it sustains everything that persists in this environment. The material that reaches these depths is often referred to as marine snow, though it does not resemble snowfall in any immediate sense. It consists of tiny particles, organic remains, microscopic organisms, and fragments of biological activity that have detached from upper layers of the ocean. These particles drift downward over extended periods, their movement shaped by gravity and gentle currents that guide them through vast distances. As they fall, much of this material is altered or consumed before it reaches the seafloor. Microorganisms intercept and process it along the way, breaking it down into smaller components. By the time it arrives at the deepest levels, what remains is reduced, both in quantity and in energy content. Yet even in this diminished form, it becomes the primary source of sustenance for organisms that have adapted to rely on such limited input. Life here does not depend on frequent feeding, but on the ability to make use of what is available, no matter how small. Organisms are structured to capture and process these particles with efficiency, extracting as much energy as possible from each fragment. This requires a different balance than in more productive environments, where abundance allows for greater expenditure. In the trench, survival is linked to conservation, to the careful management of resources that arrive slowly and unpredictably. Metabolic processes operate at reduced rates, allowing organisms to maintain their functions with minimal energy. Growth occurs gradually, often extending over long periods, and lifespans reflect this pace. Rather than rapid cycles of development and reproduction, life unfolds steadily, aligned with the availability of sustenance rather than fixed intervals. This creates a system where continuity is maintained through endurance rather than expansion. The organisms themselves reflect this adaptation. Their bodies are designed to function under conditions where energy must be preserved, with structures that support efficient feeding and minimal movement. Many rely on passive strategies, allowing particles to come to them rather than actively seeking food. Others move slowly across the seafloor, processing sediment that contains traces of organic material extracting what little energy remains within it. This approach creates an ecosystem that is both simple and stable. There are fewer layers within the food web, fewer interactions that depend on rapid exchange. Each organism plays a role that is closely tied to the limited resources available, forming a network that remains balanced through restraint. The absence of sunlight does not eliminate life, but reshapes it into forms that align with the conditions of the environment. Time, in this context, takes on a different character. Processes unfold at a pace that reflects the scarcity of energy, with changes occurring gradually rather than abruptly. The arrival of new material from above is continuous, yet never overwhelming, ensuring that the system remains steady without sudden fluctuations. In this quiet exchange between surface and depth, life persists through connection rather than isolation. The trench, though distant, remains linked to the broader ocean through the steady descent of organic material. Each particle carries with it a trace of energy, and together they form a pathway that sustains an ecosystem defined not by abundance, but by the careful use of what arrives from above. Not all energy in the ocean arrives from above. In certain deep environments, it rises from within the earth itself, carried through fractures and openings where chemical compounds emerge into the surrounding water. These places, though distant from the trench floor, reveal a different pathway for life, one that does not depend on the steady descent of organic material, but on reactions that unfold in darkness, driven by substances released from below. Around hydrothermal vents and cold seeps, bacteria form the foundation of this alternative system. Instead of relying on light, they use chemicals such as hydrogen sulfide or methane, converting them into energy through a process known as chemosynthesis. This transformation supports entire communities, where organisms gather in proximity to these sources, forming ecosystems that are both localized and self-sustaining. The presence of such systems reshapes the understanding of how life can persist in environments where sunlight does not reach. These bacteria do not require the connection to surface processes that defines other deep ecosystems. Their energy source originates from geological activity, linking biology directly to the internal dynamics of the planet. In these settings, life is built upon chemical gradients rather than falling debris, creating a structure that operates independently of the slow downward flow that sustains much of the deep ocean. While the Mariana Trench itself does not host the same concentration of vents as other regions, the existence of chemosynthetic systems nearby suggests that similar processes could occur within its depths, even if they are less visible or more widely dispersed. Chemical interactions between the seafloor and surrounding water may create localized conditions where microorganisms can draw energy from reactions that are not immediately apparent. These processes may not form large, concentrated communities, but they contribute to a broader understanding of how life adapts to varied sources of energy. Within the trench, the possibility of such systems remains part of ongoing study. Subtle chemical gradients, interactions between sediment and underlying rock, and the presence of compounds that support microbial life all point toward a complexity that extends beyond what can be observed directly. The environment may host forms of life that operate on scales too small or too diffuse to be easily detected, yet still play a role in the overall balance of the ecosystem. This perspective expands the definition of what constitutes a viable habitat. Life is not limited to conditions that mirror those at the surface, nor is it confined to systems that rely on a single source of energy. Instead, it demonstrates an ability to adapt to whatever pathways are available, whether they originate from above, from within, or from interactions between the two. The implications of this extend beyond the ocean itself. If life can sustain itself through chemical processes in the absence of sunlight, then similar conditions elsewhere become more plausible. Environments beneath icy surfaces, within subsurface oceans, or in regions where light does not penetrate may still support biological systems, provided that the necessary chemical interactions are present. In this way, the study of deep ocean chemistry becomes part of a larger exploration, one that considers how life might exist in places that differ greatly from familiar environments. The trench, while defined by its depth and isolation, contributes to this understanding by existing within a network of processes that connect geology, chemistry, and biology. Here, energy does not arrive in a single form. It emerges through multiple pathways, each supporting life in ways that reflect the conditions of the environment. The presence of chemosynthesis, whether directly within the trench or in nearby systems, reveals that life's persistence is not bound to one method, but shaped by the possibilities offered by the planet itself. At a certain depth, capability does not end abruptly, it narrows. The tools that carried earlier descents and later returns continue to function, yet they do so within boundaries that remain difficult to extend. Each layer below the surface introduces conditions that reshape how technology must be built, tested, and trusted, until the process of reaching the deepest regions becomes less about expansion and more about careful negotiation with limits that do not yield easily. Materials form the first boundary. Pressure-resistant alloys, specialized ceramics, and reinforced composites are designed to endure sustained compression, yet even these must operate within precise tolerances. The deeper a vessel travels, the more critical uniformity becomes, as any variation in thickness or composition can alter how stress is distributed across its structure. The challenge is not simply to resist pressure, but to do so consistently over time, without gradual deformation or hidden fatigue that might only reveal itself under repeated exposure. This requirement shapes the entire design process. Components cannot be chosen solely for strength. They must also behave predictably under conditions that compress and constrain at every level. Seals, joints, and viewing ports must align with exact precision, forming boundaries that remain intact despite the continuous force applied from all directions. Even with these considerations, the margin for error remains small, and each descent carries the understanding that performance depends on every element functioning as intended. Beyond structure, navigation presents another layer of complexity. At extreme depth, familiar positioning systems do not operate in the same way. Signals that rely on satellites cannot reach these regions, and visual reference points are limited by the environment itself. Instead, navigation depends on a combination of inertial systems, sonar mapping, and careful estimation, each contributing partial information that must be integrated into a coherent sense of position. This process does not provide immediate clarity. Movement is tracked through gradual updates, corrections applied as new data becomes available. The absence of continuous external reference requires a different approach, one that accepts uncertainty as part of the process and works within it rather than attempting to eliminate it entirely. Precision is achieved not through direct measurement alone, but through the accumulation of multiple inputs that refine position over time. Communication follows a similar pattern of limitation. Signals do not travel freely through water at these depths, and the transmission of information becomes both delayed and constrained. Acoustic methods allow for contact between vessel and surface, yet these signals move slowly compared to those used in air or space. Messages are exchanged with pauses between them, creating a rhythm that reflects the medium through which they pass. This delay shapes how operations are conducted. Decisions cannot always rely on immediate feedback, and autonomy becomes an essential part of exploration. Systems must be capable of functioning independently for extended periods, carrying out tasks without continuous instruction. This requirement influences both design and operation, ensuring that each mission can proceed even when direct communication is limited. Taken together, these constraints define the current reach of exploration. It is not a lack of interest or intention that limits access to the deepest regions, but the combination of factors that must be addressed simultaneously. Materials must endure, navigation must adapt, and communication must operate within conditions that resist immediacy. Progress continues, though it does so incrementally, shaped by advances that build upon one another rather than transforming the field all at once. Each improvement extends capability slightly further, refining what can be done while acknowledging what remains beyond reach. The trench, in this context, is not inaccessible, yet it is not easily approached, existing at the edge where technology meets the enduring conditions of the deep ocean. Some of what is sent into the trench does not return, and its absence becomes part of the record as surely as any data that reaches the surface. Instruments descend with purpose, carrying sensors, cameras, and collection systems designed to extend observation beyond the limits of human presence. They move through the water with careful calibration, guided toward a destination that remains unchanged, yet the outcome of each deployment is never fully assured. As these devices enter deeper layers, they encounter the same conditions that shape every aspect of the trench. Pressure increases without interruption, acting upon housings, seals, and internal components with a force that tests their construction over time. Materials that perform reliably at shallower depths may begin to respond differently, not through immediate failure, but through gradual strain that accumulates beyond visible thresholds. The environment does not require a single weakness to cause disruption, only a combination of factors that align in ways that cannot always be predicted in advance. Some instruments cease transmitting data before their mission is complete. The signal fades, not as a sudden break, but as a gradual loss of contact, leaving only the last recorded information as a reference point. Whether the cause lies in structural compromise, electronic failure, or interference within the communication pathway, the result is the same: a presence that continues below without further connection to those who sent it. Other devices reach the seafloor and operate as intended for a time, collecting measurements, recording observations, and storing information within their systems. Yet the process of returning introduces its own uncertainties. Recovery depends on precise timing, on the successful release of weights, or the activation of buoyancy systems that allow the instrument to rise. If any part of the sequence is disrupted, the device may remain where it settled, its data contained within, inaccessible despite having been gathered. Locating these instruments after deployment presents additional challenges. The vastness of the ocean floor, combined with limited visibility and the absence of fixed landmarks, makes precise positioning difficult. Even when coordinates are known, slight variations in current or descent path can shift the final location, requiring careful searching that may not always lead to retrieval. The trench does not offer easy reference, and without clear markers, the process becomes one of estimation, guided by incomplete information. In some cases, the instruments themselves become part of the environment they were sent to study. They rest within the sediment, gradually integrating into the surroundings, their materials subject to the same conditions that shape everything at that depth. Over time, Their presence may remain unchanged, or it may alter subtly, influenced by the pressure, temperature, and chemical composition of the environment. Each loss carries with it both the absence of data and the acknowledgement of limits. The design and deployment of equipment continue to improve, incorporating lessons drawn from previous missions, yet the conditions of the trench ensure that uncertainty remains. No system can be entirely insulated from the forces it encounters, and each descent reflects a balance between preparation and the acceptance of outcomes that cannot be fully controlled. This uncertainty does not prevent exploration, but it shapes how it proceeds. Redundancy is built into systems. Multiple instruments are deployed when possible, and data is transmitted continuously to reduce reliance on retrieval alone. These approaches increase the likelihood of success, yet they do not eliminate the possibility of loss. In this environment, every mission carries with it an understanding that not all efforts will return in full. What is sent downward may contribute to knowledge, even if it remains below, its presence marking the boundary between what can be recovered and what must be left behind. Across the surface of the planet, the ocean extends in a continuous field that resists simple measurement, its scale felt more than easily understood. Beneath that surface, the depth multiplies the sense of distance, creating layers that remain far removed from direct observation. The trench exists within this vastness, not as an isolated feature, but as part of a system so large that even sustained effort reveals only fragments at a time. Exploration moves within this scale with careful limitation. The number of vehicles capable of reaching the deepest regions remains small, each one representing years of design, testing, and refinement. These machines are not produced in large numbers, nor are they easily replaced. Their construction requires specialized materials, precise engineering, and a level of reliability that must be maintained under conditions that cannot be fully replicated at the surface. As a result, each vehicle becomes both a tool and a responsibility, deployed with consideration rather than frequency. The process of preparing a single mission reflects this constraint. Support vessels must be equipped to transport, launch, and recover deep diving systems. Teams coordinate navigation, communication, and data handling, all while accounting for variables that shift with weather, current, and mechanical performance. Time at sea carries its own demands, and each day of operation contributes to the overall cost of the expedition. These costs extend beyond fuel and equipment, encompassing the infrastructure required to sustain long periods of research in remote regions. Because of this, exploration is shaped by prioritization. Scientific questions are selected with care, focusing on objectives that justify the resources required to pursue them. Not every area can be visited, and not every hypothesis can be tested directly. Decisions are made to concentrate efforts where the potential for understanding is greatest, leaving other regions, including large portions of the trench, observed only through indirect means or not at all. Instruments that can operate without direct human presence offer partial extension of reach, yet they too are limited by design and deployment. Autonomous systems follow programmed paths, collecting data within defined parameters, while remotely operated vehicles depend on stable connections that are difficult to maintain at extreme depth. Each method contributes pieces of information, but none provide a complete, continuous view of the environment. The ocean itself introduces further complexity. Its conditions are not static, and subtle variations can influence the outcome of an expedition. Currents shift, visibility changes, and the behavior of equipment can be affected in ways that are not always predictable. These factors require adjustments in real time, often narrowing the scope of what can be achieved during a single descent. Over time, knowledge accumulates slowly, built from individual missions that add detail without fully resolving the larger picture. Maps improve in resolution, biological records expand, and physical measurements become more precise, yet vast areas remain unvisited. The trench, though known in outline, retains a depth of detail that has yet to be fully observed. This limited exploration does not reflect a lack of interest, but rather the scale of what is being approached. The combination of distance, depth, cost, and technological constraint creates a boundary that is gradually extended rather than rapidly crossed. Each mission moves that boundary slightly, adding clarity while revealing how much remains beyond current reach. In this way, the trench exists as both a studied environment and an open expanse, defined by what has been seen and by the far greater portion that has not. Maps of distant worlds often appear with clean outlines and gradual shading, their surfaces reconstructed from signals that travel across open space with little resistance. In contrast, the vast regions beneath Earth's oceans remain only partially traced, their contours suggested by fragments of data gathered slowly and with effort. The difference does not arise from a lack of attention, but from the environments through which each form of exploration must move. Beyond the atmosphere, communication unfolds through a near vacuum where signals travel with predictable behavior. Spacecraft send information across immense distances, yet the medium between sender and receiver introduces little distortion. Instruments orbiting planets or crossing interplanetary space maintain steady contact, allowing data to arrive in continuous streams. Even at great distances, adjustments can be made with clarity, guided by transmissions that remain stable over time. Beneath the ocean, the situation shifts. Water absorbs and scatters many forms of signal, particularly those relied upon for rapid communication. Radio waves weaken quickly, leaving sound as the primary means of transmitting information. Acoustic signals move more slowly, bending with changes in temperature, pressure, and salinity. Messages take longer to arrive, and their paths are less direct, shaped by layers within the water that redirect and diffuse their energy. This creates a form of distance that is not measured only in space, but in the complexity of the medium itself. Navigation follows a similar contrast. In space, position can be determined through established reference points, guided by celestial mechanics and precise tracking systems. Paths are calculated with consistency, and motion follows trajectories that can be predicted far in advance. Within the deep ocean, visibility is absent, and external references fade away. Vehicles rely on internal systems, sonar reflections, and estimations that accumulate small uncertainties over time. Movement becomes a careful progression rather than a direct course, shaped by limited awareness of surroundings. The act of mapping reflects these differences. Orbital instruments survey planetary surfaces from above, collecting wide fields of data in a single pass. Repeated orbits refine the image, gradually increasing resolution until broad regions are understood in detail. The ocean floor cannot be approached in the same way. Depth prevents distant observation, requiring instruments to move close to the terrain they measure. Each pass covers a narrow area, and progress emerges through repeated journeys that extend outward piece by piece. Cost and accessibility further shape this contrast. Launching a mission into space demands significant resources, yet once beyond the atmosphere, the operating environment remains relatively stable. Systems encounter extremes, but these are consistent and well studied. In the deep ocean, pressure, corrosion, and mechanical strain act continuously on equipment. Every descent places materials under conditions that challenge their limits, and each return requires careful recovery. The cycle of deployment and retrieval adds layers of complexity that influence how often missions can be attempted. These differences have led to an unexpected balance. The surfaces of distant planets, including Mars, have been mapped with a level of detail that surpasses much of Earth's own seafloor. This outcome reflects the relative ease of observing outward compared to downward, where proximity introduces greater difficulty rather than greater clarity. Exploration continues in both directions, guided by the same desire to understand what lies beyond immediate reach. Yet the paths diverge in their demands, one extending through open space, the other descending into a dense and shifting world. Each reveals its own form of distance, measured not only in miles, but in the challenges required to cross them. Inside the narrow interior of a deep submersible, the sense of space becomes defined not by distance, but by boundaries that remain constant for hours at a time. The walls do not shift, the available movement remains limited, and every action must be deliberate. There is no horizon to orient against, no natural reference that marks progression, only the awareness of a steady descent and the quiet presence of instruments that translate the outside world into numbers and signals. As the journey continues, external cues begin to fall away. Light has long since faded, and with it, the subtle changes that usually mark the passage of time. The human mind, accustomed to cycles of brightness and shadow, adjusts slowly to an environment where those signals are absent. Without variation, moments begin to feel extended, their edges less distinct, as if time itself has softened into a continuous flow. Sound contributes to this altered perception. The interior carries only the low hum of systems in operation, a steady background that rarely changes. There are no distant echoes of movement, no shifting patterns of noise to suggest activity beyond the vessel. The absence of familiar sound creates a kind of stillness that is not silence, but a narrow band of consistent vibration. Within it, attention turns inward, drawn toward the smallest changes, the faintest fluctuations in rhythm. In such conditions, focus becomes both a necessity and a discipline. Each instrument demands careful observation, each reading interpreted with precision. The margin for error remains small, and the environment does not allow for distraction. Tasks are performed methodically, guided by procedure and experience, yet always with an awareness that the surrounding conditions permit little room for correction. Concentration settles into a steady state, maintained over long stretches without interruption. The confinement of the space reinforces this focus. There is no opportunity to step away, no separate environment to provide relief from the intensity of observation. The same surfaces, the same arrangement of controls remain constant throughout the mission. Over time, familiarity with this limited setting deepens, and the mind adapts, finding stability within repetition rather than seeking variation. Isolation extends beyond physical space. Communication with the surface, when available, arrives with delay and brevity. Messages are exchanged with care, often reduced to essential information. The sense of distance is not only measured in depth, but in the separation from immediate interaction. This distance shapes the experience, creating a condition where decisions must often be made within the confines of the vessel, supported by training and preparation rather than direct guidance. Yet within this environment, resilience emerges not as a sudden response, but as a gradual alignment. The mind adjusts to the rhythm of the mission, to the patterns of observation and response that define each moment. What might initially feel unfamiliar becomes structured, even steady, as attention narrows to the tasks at hand. The external world, though distant and largely unseen, is translated into a form that can be engaged with, understood through instruments and interpretation. This adaptation does not remove the awareness of depth or distance. It remains present, a constant layer beneath every action, shaping decisions and reinforcing caution. But it does not overwhelm. Instead, it becomes part of the environment itself, integrated into the experience in the same way as pressure, darkness, and time. In this way, the human presence within extreme depth is sustained not by resistance to the environment, but by a quiet adjustment to it, where focus, structure, and steady attention allow the mind to move alongside the conditions rather than against them. There are places within the trench that exist only as absence, not in the sense of emptiness, but as regions where no direct observation has yet reached. Their presence is inferred through surrounding measurements, through gradients in depth and subtle variations in terrain that suggest continuity beyond the edges of known data. These areas do not appear on maps as defined landscapes, but as softened boundaries, where detail fades into suggestion. Mapping efforts, even after years of careful work, remain incomplete. Sonar passes trace narrow paths across the seafloor, each line contributing a fragment of structure, yet vast stretches between these paths remain unresolved. The resulting image resembles a mosaic with missing pieces, where the overall form is visible, but the finer patterns are left undefined. Depth can be estimated, contours can be suggested, yet the precise shape of the terrain, its textures, and small variations remain largely unseen. Within these unobserved regions, the possibility of undiscovered life persists as a quiet expectation rather than a dramatic unknown. Organisms that have not yet been recorded may exist within sediments, along subtle ridges, or within microenvironments shaped by currents and chemical gradients. The forms already encountered suggest that life adapts in ways that do not always align with familiar structures, leaving open the likelihood that additional variations remain beyond current observation. Biological records, though expanding, still represent only a fraction of what may be present. Samples collected from specific locations provide detailed insights into localized communities, yet these findings cannot be extended with certainty across the entire trench. Conditions shift with depth, pressure, and composition of the seafloor, creating distinct habitats that may support different forms of life. Without direct exploration, these variations remain inferred rather than confirmed. Uncertainty also extends to processes that shape the environment itself. Sediment movement, chemical exchange, and subtle geological activity continue over long periods, often beyond the timescale of individual missions. Instruments capture brief intervals, offering glimpses into systems that operate continuously. The full patterns of these processes, their rhythms and interactions, remain only partially understood, forming a background of ongoing change that is difficult to observe in its entirety. Even the interpretation of collected data carries its own limitations. Measurements depend on calibration, on the assumptions built into instruments and methods. Small deviations can influence results, and in an environment where direct verification is rare, these deviations may persist unnoticed. Scientists account for these uncertainties through repetition and comparison, yet the margins remain, shaping conclusions with a degree of caution. The trench, as it is currently known, exists as a layered understanding, built from observation, inference, and careful extrapolation. Each layer adds clarity while revealing the extent of what remains beyond reach. The unknown is not a singular mystery, but a collection of unanswered details, each tied to a specific place, a specific process, or a specific form of life that has yet to be directly encountered. Progress continues in measured steps, extending knowledge outward from known points. Each mission refines the map. Each sample adds to the biological record. Each dataset contributes to a more detailed picture. Yet the scale of the environment ensures that this progress remains gradual, unfolding over time rather than arriving all at once. In this way, the trench holds a balance between what has been seen and what remains unseen, its depths defined not only by their physical extent, but by the quiet persistence of unanswered detail that continues to shape the pursuit of understanding. Across the slow expansion of deep exploration, new instruments have begun to move through the trench with a kind of quiet independence, extending observation beyond the limits once set by direct human presence. These systems do not replace earlier methods, but rather add new layers of reach, allowing the environment to be approached from multiple directions at once. Each carries its own way of sensing, recording, and returning information, contributing to a broader, more continuous understanding. Remotely operated vehicles travel downward through long tethered lines, their connection to the surface, both a constraint and a lifeline. Through this connection, operators guide their movement with precision, adjusting position in response to terrain, currents, and unexpected features. Cameras transmit live images upward, revealing textures and forms that had previously been inferred rather than seen. Mechanical arms extend outward, capable of collecting samples or interacting gently with the seafloor, translating human intention into careful motion within an environment that remains physically distant. Alongside these systems, autonomous underwater vehicles follow a different path. Once released, they move without continuous input, guided by internal navigation systems that track position through a combination of inertial measurement and acoustic reference points. Their routes are pre-planned, yet adaptable, allowing them to cover wide areas methodically. As they move, they gather data across multiple sensors, mapping depth, recording chemical composition, and capturing subtle variations in the surrounding water. When they return, their stored information unfolds as a detailed record of places that were never directly observed in real time. Advances in mapping technology have reshaped how these journeys are understood. Multi-beam sonar systems sweep across the seafloor, sending out arrays of sound that reflect back with information about distance and shape. Each pass contributes a band of detail, and when combined over multiple missions, these bands form increasingly refined images. The resulting maps reveal structures that were once invisible: gentle slopes, sharp transitions, and patterns in sediment that suggest movement over long periods. Resolution improves gradually, turning broad outlines into textured landscapes. Improvements in imaging have also altered the clarity of observation. High-sensitivity cameras operate in near darkness, capturing faint details with minimal artificial illumination. Lighting systems are designed to reduce disturbance, allowing scenes to be recorded with a balance that preserves both visibility and the natural state of the environment. The images they produce do not simply document presence, but reveal relationships between organisms and their surroundings, offering context that was once difficult to obtain. Communication between surface and depth continues to evolve, adapting to the constraints of the medium. Acoustic systems carry commands and data across layers of water, refined through advances in signal processing that improve clarity and reduce interference. While still limited by speed and environmental variation, these systems have become more reliable, enabling longer and more coordinated missions. With these tools, access to extreme depths has expanded, not in sudden leaps, but through steady extension. Areas that were once approached only briefly can now be revisited with greater precision, and regions beyond immediate reach can be surveyed indirectly through systematic coverage. The trench remains vast, its scale unchanged, yet the pathways into it have multiplied, creating opportunities to observe with greater continuity. Each new system adds to a growing network of exploration where data from different sources converge, forming a more complete picture than any single method could provide. The process remains gradual, shaped by the same challenges that have always defined deep exploration, yet guided by tools that move further, stay longer, and return with more detail than before. Momentum in deep exploration now builds in a way that feels gradual yet persistent, shaped by many small advances that begin to align with one another. Missions no longer stand entirely alone, separated by long intervals, but instead form part of a growing sequence where each effort informs the next. Data collected from earlier expeditions is carried forward, refined, and expanded, creating a sense of continuity that allows research to move with greater direction than before. Research vessels continue to return to the region, guided by increasingly precise objectives. Instead of broad surveys alone, missions now focus on specific features, revisiting areas to observe change over time or to gather more detailed measurements. This repetition, once limited by cost and capability, has become more feasible as systems improve. The trench is approached not as a single destination, but as a field of ongoing study, where knowledge accumulates through sustained attention rather than isolated encounters. Technological development plays a central role in this shift. Materials designed to withstand extreme conditions are becoming more reliable, extending the lifespan of equipment and reducing the uncertainty that once limited deployment. Navigation systems grow more accurate, integrating multiple forms of sensing to maintain position even in the absence of external reference points. Energy storage improves as well, allowing vehicles to remain active for longer durations, increasing the amount of data that can be gathered in a single descent. Imaging continues to evolve, revealing finer details with greater clarity. Subtle features that were once indistinct now appear with definition, allowing researchers to observe patterns in sediment, variations in terrain, and interactions between organisms and their surroundings. These improvements do not transform the environment into something fully visible, but they narrow the gap between presence and understanding, offering glimpses that carry more context than before. Scientific interest expands alongside these capabilities. Fields that once operated separately begin to intersect, bringing together perspectives from geology, biology, chemistry, and physics. The trench becomes a point of convergence, where questions about life, environment, and planetary processes meet within a single setting. Collaborative efforts grow, with institutions sharing data and coordinating missions, creating a network of research that extends beyond individual projects. This expansion introduces new lines of inquiry. The behavior of organisms under extreme conditions, the movement of materials across depth, and the long-term stability of the seafloor all become subjects of sustained investigation. Each question leads to another, not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual unfolding, where answers deepen understanding while revealing additional layers that remain to be explored. Access to the deep continues to widen, though it does so with measured pace. Equipment becomes more adaptable, capable of operating across a range of depths and conditions, reducing the need for entirely separate systems. Training expands as well, allowing more researchers to engage directly with the process of exploration, whether through direct involvement in missions or through the interpretation of collected data. The future of this work does not suggest a complete unveiling, nor does it point toward a single defining discovery. Instead, it reflects a steady progression where the boundaries of knowledge shift outward with each carefully conducted mission. The trench remains vast, its scale unchanged, yet the pathways into it become more numerous, more refined, and more consistent. In this unfolding effort, the unknown does not diminish all at once. It recedes slowly, shaped by attention, patience, and the accumulation of detail. Each descent contributes a small but lasting addition, and together, these additions begin to form a more continuous understanding, one that remains open, yet increasingly defined by what has been carefully brought into view. There is a persistence in scientific attention that does not rely on spectacle, but on a steady return to places where understanding remains incomplete. The trench draws this attention not through constant change, but through its resistance to easy explanation, offering a setting where familiar rules are stretched into unfamiliar forms. Researchers are not guided by urgency alone, but by a quiet recognition that certain environments hold answers that cannot be found elsewhere, and that these answers reveal themselves only through continued presence. Curiosity here does not arrive as a sudden impulse, but as a long, sustained inclination to look closer, to measure more carefully, and to return even when results seem minimal. Each descent carries the weight of earlier observations, extending them rather than replacing them. Patterns begin to emerge slowly, not as clear outlines, but as subtle consistencies that suggest underlying processes waiting to be understood with greater precision. The study of life under such conditions offers a particular kind of insight. Organisms that persist in these depths do not simply survive. They reflect a set of adaptations that reshape assumptions about what living systems require. Their structures, their behaviors, and their metabolic rhythms reveal strategies that operate with extreme efficiency, where energy is conserved with remarkable discipline and change unfolds over extended periods. These forms of life expand the boundaries of biology, suggesting that existence is not confined to the conditions once considered necessary. Observation of these systems contributes to a broader understanding of Earth itself. The trench functions as a record, where materials accumulate and processes leave traces over time. Sediments settle, compounds transform, and interactions between organisms and environment create layers of information that can be read with careful analysis. This record does not present itself all at once, but reveals its details gradually, requiring patience and repeated examination. Environmental monitoring becomes an extension of this work, offering a way to track changes that may otherwise pass unnoticed. Subtle shifts in chemical composition, variations in particulate flow, and the presence of external materials provide signals that connect the deepest regions of the ocean to processes occurring far above. These connections illustrate how distant systems remain linked, even across vast differences in depth and pressure, forming a continuous network that spans the entire planet. Scientific effort also carries a forward-looking dimension, where each discovery contributes to a larger framework of knowledge. The trench becomes part of a wider exploration, informing studies of other extreme environments, both on Earth and beyond. Conditions that once seemed isolated begin to resonate with findings from other regions, creating parallels that extend across disciplines. In this way, the trench is not only a destination, but a reference point, grounding broader inquiries in observed reality. As research continues, the accumulation of detail shapes a more nuanced understanding. What was once perceived as a single, distant environment becomes a collection of interconnected systems, each with its own characteristics and dynamics. This complexity does not diminish the sense of mystery, but refines it, replacing broad unknowns with more specific questions that guide further study. The motivation to continue does not depend on reaching a final answer. Instead, it rests in the recognition that knowledge grows through careful extension, where each observation adds depth to what is already known. The trench remains a place where this process unfolds with particular clarity, its vastness accommodating both what has been discovered and what remains beyond current reach. In this ongoing effort, the pursuit of understanding becomes its own form of continuity, linking past explorations with those yet to come. Each mission, each measurement, and each quiet observation contributes to a body of knowledge that expands slowly, shaped by attention, patience, and the enduring presence of a place that continues to invite careful study. Protection begins not at the surface, but in the recognition that even the most distant environments remain connected to everything above them. The trench exists as part of a continuous system, shaped by processes that extend across oceans and continents, gathering their influence slowly as materials descend through layers of water. What settles there carries traces of distant origins, forming a quiet record of interaction between human activity and the most remote regions of the planet. Within this depth, ecosystems persist with a balance that is both delicate and enduring. Life does not occupy these spaces in abundance, but in careful distribution, where each organism exists within narrow limits shaped by pressure, temperature, and the steady arrival of nutrients. These conditions create relationships that are finely tuned, where disruption does not spread rapidly, yet lingers with lasting effect. Recovery, when it occurs, unfolds over extended periods, reflecting the slow pace at which life operates in such an environment. Human influence reaches downward in subtle ways, carried by particles too small to notice in motion, yet significant in accumulation. Materials introduced at the surface move through ocean currents, breaking apart, combining with organic matter, and gradually descending. By the time they arrive at these depths, they are no longer recognizable in their original form, yet their presence remains embedded within the environment. Chemical traces settle into sediments, and fragments become part of the cycles that sustain deep communities, altering them in ways that are not always immediately visible. These changes do not present themselves as sudden transformations, but as gradual shifts that become apparent only through careful observation. Measurements taken across time reveal patterns that suggest influence rather than immediate consequence. The trench becomes a place where these patterns can be studied with clarity, offering insight into how distant actions accumulate and persist within isolated systems. This understanding carries significance beyond the depths themselves, extending into broader considerations of how environments respond to sustained pressure. Efforts to preserve these regions develop from this awareness, shaped by the need to reduce impact before it becomes irreversible. Scientific missions incorporate practices that limit disturbance, ensuring that observation does not alter the conditions being studied. Equipment is designed to minimize contact, and sampling is conducted with restraint, guided by the recognition that each interaction leaves a trace. These approaches reflect a shift in perspective, where exploration is balanced with responsibility. Conservation at such depths also involves a wider framework, where policies and agreements extend across national boundaries. The ocean does not conform to borders, and its most remote areas require cooperation that mirrors their scale. International efforts aim to regulate activities that could introduce further disruption, from resource extraction to waste disposal, acknowledging that protection must operate across the same interconnected systems that define the environment itself. Long-term considerations emerge from this collective effort, emphasizing the importance of continuity in both observation and protection. The trench offers a baseline, a reference point where natural processes can be observed with minimal interference when preserved carefully. Maintaining this baseline allows future changes to be understood with greater clarity, providing context for shifts that might otherwise remain unnoticed. As attention remains fixed on these depths, the significance of protection becomes part of an ongoing narrative, where each action contributes to the condition of an environment that evolves slowly yet persistently. The trench does not demand urgency through visible change, but through its quiet capacity to record the consequences of distant choices. In preserving it, there is a recognition that even the most remote places remain part of a shared system, where care taken at one level resonates across all others, shaping the continuity of life in ways that unfold over time. There are places that remain defined not by what has been revealed, but by the vast proportion that has not. The trench exists within this category, not as a hidden corner waiting to be completed, but as a space where knowledge expands slowly against an immense backdrop of absence. Even after decades of attention, its depths continue to hold more uncertainty than clarity, forming a landscape where each confirmed detail is surrounded by far larger regions still unobserved. Its scale resists simple framing. The descent alone suggests distance, yet distance here is not only vertical, it extends across a horizontal reach that remains largely unmapped in fine detail, where stretches of seafloor lie beyond direct observation. Instruments have passed above these regions, tracing outlines and generating approximations, but the textures and subtle variations remain unseen, existing only as inferred shapes within broader surveys. This imbalance between what is known and what remains unseen gives the trench a particular character. It is not empty of information, but rich in fragments that do not yet connect into a complete picture. Observations arrive as isolated pieces, gathered from brief visits, each one expanding understanding, while also revealing the limits of what has been covered. The effect is cumulative, yet incomplete, forming a mosaic where large sections remain undefined. The comparison to other environments emerges naturally, though without diminishing the uniqueness of this depth. Regions beyond Earth have been mapped with increasing clarity, their surfaces rendered in detail through remote sensing. In contrast, the ocean floor beneath these depths remains less resolved, not due to lack of interest, but because of the difficulty inherent in reaching and observing it directly. The contrast highlights how proximity does not always translate to accessibility, and how the familiar can remain distant when conditions impose strict limits. What lies beneath continues to suggest complexity rather than uniformity. Subtle variations in terrain, shifts in sediment composition, and the presence of localized features indicate a dynamic system shaped over long periods. These variations do not announce themselves clearly, but require careful interpretation, often through indirect measurements that hint at structures not yet seen in detail. The trench becomes a place where inference plays a significant role, guiding understanding until direct observation can follow. The sense of frontier here is not driven by expansion into new territory in the traditional sense, but by the gradual refinement of awareness within an existing space. Exploration does not proceed through rapid coverage, but through repeated returns, each mission extending the boundary of what is known by a small but meaningful margin. Progress is measured not in large discoveries alone, but in the accumulation of precise data that clarifies what was once uncertain. This ongoing process reflects a broader relationship between humanity and the planet it inhabits. Even within a world that appears extensively explored, there remain environments that resist full comprehension. The trench stands as a reminder of this reality. Its depth-preserving conditions that limit access and slow the pace of discovery. It does not conceal its nature intentionally, but simply exists under constraints that challenge the tools and methods used to observe it. As attention continues to return, the trench maintains its position as one of the least explored regions on Earth, not through neglect, but through the scale of effort required to understand it fully. Each descent contributes to a growing body of knowledge, yet also reinforces the awareness that much remains beyond current reach. In this balance between discovery and uncertainty, the trench persists as a frontier defined not by its distance, but by the depth of what is still waiting to be known. In the slow accumulation of observation, the trench reveals itself as something both approached and never fully reached, a place where knowledge gathers in careful layers, while much of its character remains beyond direct view. It has been visited, measured, and recorded, yet it continues to exist with a depth that resists complete description, holding within it a balance between what has been brought into understanding and what remains suspended in quiet distance. Earlier descents linger as faint impressions, not as repeated accounts, but as moments that shaped the way attention returns to this environment. Each journey added clarity in small increments, tracing outlines where there were once only assumptions. Yet, even as these outlines became more defined, they revealed further complexity, suggesting that the process of knowing would extend far beyond any single mission or generation. The trench carries a dual nature, where familiarity and mystery exist side by side without conflict. Instruments have touched its floor, light has briefly illuminated its contours, and data has translated fragments of its structure into forms that can be studied. At the same time, vast regions remain unseen, their presence inferred through patterns and signals rather than direct observation. This coexistence does not diminish its significance, but deepens it, allowing the trench to remain both a subject of study and a reminder of limits. Understanding here develops through patience rather than completion. The pace at which information emerges mirrors the environment itself, measured and deliberate, shaped by conditions that allow only careful progress. Each finding becomes part of a broader context, contributing to a narrative that grows without closing, extending outward rather than arriving at a final point. There is a certain stillness in recognizing this balance, an awareness that some places retain their depth not only in physical terms, but in the extent to which they can be known. The trench reflects this idea with clarity, offering a space where curiosity continues without the expectation of total resolution. It remains open, not in the sense of being unfinished, but in the sense of allowing exploration to remain ongoing. This perspective reaches beyond the trench itself, touching on a broader relationship with the natural world. Even within a planet that has been extensively observed, there remain regions where understanding is partial, where the boundaries of knowledge shift gradually with each new effort. These regions invite attention not through urgency, but through the quiet persistence of their presence. As the narrative settles, the trench remains in view, not as a distant anomaly, but as part of a continuous system that extends from the surface to the deepest points below. Its existence reinforces the idea that discovery is not confined to what is immediately visible, but includes what lies beyond easy reach, waiting to be approached with care and time. If this journey has held your attention, you can continue alongside it by supporting the work that brings these stories forward. A simple gesture of appreciation, a quiet acknowledgement through a like or a subscription helps sustain the space where these explorations unfold. In doing so, the process of looking deeper continues, carried gently from one moment of curiosity to the next, allowing the unseen to remain within reach of understanding even as it keeps a part of itself just beyond it.